Is a kiss between two men obscene? For Rio de Janeiro Mayor Marcelo Crivella, the answer is yes. He used his administration to try and censor a Marvel comic book containing a scene in which two male, fully clothed characters kiss. Crivella called it pornography targeted at children and teenagers. But in a country that figures among the top 10 consumers of porn on the internet, the argument that teens would have to buy a comic book to see explicit images is ridiculous. Not to mention that by Crivella's standards, the frescoes of the Sistine Chapel, which include a few images of men kissing, would also have to be covered. However, this kind of move is part of a ramping up of actions to curb freedom of speech in Brazil, attacks which have come not only from the right, but also from the left. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro, Editor-in-Chief of the Brazilian Report. This is Explaining Brazil. Maria Marta Bruno, hello.
Hi, Gustavo.
You are the Brazilian Report's eyes and ears in Rio. Tell me what happened.
Well, last Thursday, Rio Mayor Marcelo Crivella received reports on the internet from visitors who were outraged by this Avengers comic book in which two gay male characters share a kiss. The book was on sale at Rio's International Book Biennale last week. On Friday, the next day, he sent auditors to check if pornographic or improper material was being sold to children and issued a decision saying that the Avengers comic he despised so much should be wrapped in a black bag with a parental advisory seal on it.
So, did it work?
No, not at all, Gustavo. For one, because the controversy made the cartoon more popular than it would be otherwise. It was sold out in 35 minutes on Friday, the day after Crivella's announcement. On Saturday, Folha de São Paulo, the biggest Brazil newspaper, ran the Kiss panel on its front page. Also, the Biennale's organizers refused to abide by the decision, which triggered a legal battle. A state court confirmed Crivella's determination, but on Sunday, the Supreme Court struck it down.
What did the justices say?
Celso de Mello, he's the longest-serving justice on the Supreme Court. He said the decision comes from, quote, regressive minds who defend a dystopian view of society.
Ouch.
Yeah, he pulled no punches.
So upon first glance, we could say that Crivella's move totally backfired. I mean, more people saw the comics, and he was pretty much isolated in this ideological crusade against the gay kiss. But regardless of what happened to the comic, the stunt could be beneficial to the mayor, right?
Yes, absolutely. And to explain how, you need to know exactly who Marcelo Crivella is.
So, who is he?
Crivella is an evangelical bishop who belongs to the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, which is owned by his uncle, Bishop Edir Macedo. Edir Macedo is a highly controversial figure, having been accused of crimes such as corruption and racketeering in the past. Nowadays, Edir Macedo's power comes not only from the church, but also from his television network, Record, which is the second biggest terrestrial channel in Brazil. And his station has always been close to power, no matter who's in charge. At one point, Macedo was backing former President Lula, but as the tide turned, he migrated and now is a very powerful ally from President Bolsonaro.
And how does Crivella fit this scene?
So Crivella enters the political scene in 2002 when he was elected senator. He then has a series of failure attempts to become Rio's mayor and governor. Every time he would face massive scrutiny from the press, which he accused of conspiring against him.
But then comes 2016.
Yes, by that year, the left-wing parties were extremely weakened, and he managed to win as a conservative candidate. In the runoff stage, Crivella faced a congressman from the far left, Marcelo Freixo, in what was an extremely polarized election in Rio.
Sempre chega a nossa vez quando a gente não desiste.
And how has Crivella's tenure been in City Hall?
Extremely rocky, Gustavo. He has dodged not one, but two impeachment requests, and he has overseen a rapid process of degradation in Rio. The city has really felt the blow of the 2014-2016 recession, and since the Olympics, it has been all downhill. We have problems with healthcare and transportation services, for instance. To make matters worse, Rio suffered the floods early this year, which killed more than a dozen of people. And during the crisis, his administration was particularly inept in dealing with it. There is no single aspect that the administration has excelled in, actually.
So Crivella would be the first to want to shift the conversation from politics and public administration to pretty much anything else.
Exactly. And talking about a gay kiss in a comic book not only allow him to avoid talking about what he has effectively accomplished, but it also panders to the most conservative and religious sectors of the city. He's hoping to be the right-wing candidate next year when he's set to stand for re-election. So he needs a core base of support if he is to stand a chance.
And how is the 2020 municipal race shaping up so far?
It's too soon to know. President Bolsonaro's group hasn't zeroed in on a candidate yet, and the left seems to be split in Rio. We should have a crowded field, though, and the earlier Crivella is able to rally a fervent core of supporters, the more likely he will at least make a runoff.
Maria, thank you very much. After the break, a look into the state of freedom of speech in Brazil. We'll be right back.
Hi, my name is Lucas Berti and I work at the Brazilian Report. Do you like the Explaining Brazil podcast? Then please rate our show on whatever platform you may be listening to. And don't forget to share it with your friends and coworkers. Many people write us asking how they can support this show. The best way is by subscribing to the Brazilian Report, the journalistic engine behind this podcast. You can enjoy a 7-day free trial and subscription plans start at only $3.90 per month. That's cheaper than drinking 2 lattes a month at Starbucks. Go to Brazilian.report/subscribe.
As Maria Marta pointed out, Rio Mayor Marcelo Crivella's rant about a gay kiss was motivated by electoral goals. But attempts to censor content have increased in recent years. In 2017, conservatives managed to shut down an exhibition called Queer Museum after trying to associate homosexuality to pedophilia and bestiality. Human Rights Minister Damaris Alves also lashed out at a children's book on how to become a sorcerer, and even said that Pixar's feature animation Frozen contained subliminal messaging to, quote, turn children gay. On the other side of the spectrum, we have left-wing movements who sought to ban books from the 1930s, saying that they contain racist undertones. To discuss these initiatives, we talked to Tiago Amparo, a law professor at think tank Fundação Getúlio Vargas. He also writes about human rights and discrimination. Thanks for talking to us, Tiago. What does the Brazilian Constitution say about freedom of speech?
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you guys. So the Constitution, when it talks about freedom of speech, it talks about the freedom. It talks about freedom of speech and freedom of expression, artistic freedom, and so on. And it explicitly says without censorship, without any censorship. So the censorship, it's completely ruled out by the Constitution itself. What the Constitution, so the mayor could not simply ask the books to be removed from the book fair, but what we had in the past was one specifically decision from the Supreme Court concerning a very different case of a book that tried to deny the Holocaust, and was a very discriminatory book, and the Supreme Court considered it a racist book, and it's because the Constitution also talks about discrimination and talks about racism as a crime. So the Supreme Court said it back then, a few years ago, it said that it restricted the book on the basis of anti-racism legislation and anti-racism constitutional provision. But this was a very specific case. But overall, what we have is that we have a constitution that protects explicitly freedom of expression and explicitly mentions without any censorship.
So, if I got it right, unless a work incites a crime, which is itself a crime, its content cannot be regulated. Is that correct?
If through a book you committed a certain crime, such as inciting people to commit another crime, which is, as you said, is a crime in itself, it can be restricted because the material itself is through this material committing such a crime. And if you're inciting or practicing discrimination on several grounds, race, color, and national origin, and religion, and others, if you're inciting or practicing discrimination on those grounds, you might be committing a crime under the anti-discrimination, anti-racism law that we have.
Going back to this case in Rio, when Mayor Crivella tried to censor a comic book depicting a gay kiss, one thing strikes me. Yes, the Supreme Court reaffirmed the law of the land, and they said that there was nothing to be done about the Avenger story, but the Supreme Court only stepped in because a state court actually ruled in favor of the mayor. I mean, why are Brazilian courts so unpredictable, and how it is that each judge seems to rule based solely on their own convictions and sometimes to the detriment of the law?
This question of legal certainty is very important because the whole point of having fundamental rights and having a constitution is to have certain issues that are not always on debate and not always being revised. The very idea of having a constitution that says that you have a freedom of speech or expression without censorship is to not always having to debate again and again before courts whether certain measure is or not permissible. And what is interesting here in this series of decisions, we had actually 3 decisions. So first we had one decision from one judge from the Court of Appeal Rio that actually reversed the measure of the City Hall, saying that you could not censor those books. And then later on, the president of the same tribunal, the president of the Court of Appeal Rio, reversed this decision. And a president of a court can only reverse a decision from a fellow judge from the same court once it's a measure of it's a severe measure that can cause a public or a disorder, or can cause a very high economic impact. So it's the exceptional power of the president of a certain court to reverse a decision from a fellow judge from the same tribunal. And this only happens when you have a decision that it can cause a major impact, and you have this institutional perspective as a president of the court saying that, wait a minute, we should decide this matter in slower or something like this. So only you have it's a very exceptional circumstance. So it's interesting to see that in this measure was by the president of the Court of Appeal was he decided to reverse the decision from a fellow judge, which is usually exceptional. In this case, so it's interesting to see that this very case of just a book fair, one page in a book, was seen by the Court of Appeal as an exceptional case that could cause a public disorder. And then later on, you had three legal challenge before the Supreme Court over the weekend, because the book fair went on until Sunday, so you had to decide until Sunday. And then the Supreme Court decided on the matter and sided with the first judge, reversed the censorship. And this is very problematic in a country where certain issues such as freedom of speech and freedom from censorship should not be debated all the time. That's the whole point of having constitutional rights. And it is interesting to see that this issue was decided by the president of a court of appeal, which is only used in exceptional cases.
We tend to focus on fringe right-wing groups and their attempts to censor content they don't like. But some sectors of the left also engage in this kind of action. On one side, conservatives want to restrict speech based on the concept of protecting the family and moral values. But on the other, liberals want to do the same, based on an attempt to protect marginalized groups. Do these initiatives differ from one another?
That's a very interesting question. I remember there's one feminist, American feminist called Bell Hooks, and she has a wonderful article called Censorship from the Right and from the Left. She says that, well, you have a challenge to freedom of speech and the right to speak coming from the conservatives and from the right-wing politicians and from right-wing groups, especially towards historically disadvantaged groups such as women, men, black people, and LGBT people, and so on. But also, and she argues that, and I agree that you cannot also because of certain more left-wing ideology, cannot also censor people from the right in the way they can speak and challenge things and so on. So the idea of freedom of speech and a free market of ideas is that it ideally has no ideology. The idea is to be able to spread ideas and challenge ideas and talk about those ideas and criticize those ideas, doesn't matter if you come from the right or from the left. The problem in this case is that in the real cases is that it was a clear censorship case. But also, as you mentioned, there were instances where you had the left trying to prevent the public officials to speak in certain events, or movies to be screened, or conservative moves to be screened in universities. But what you cannot forget is that the freedom of speech occurs within a certain social context. And the social context in Brazil is that we are very good at not talking about structural issues or racism and LGBT phobia and so on. And historically, those historically vulnerable groups have been subject of censorship and not only censorship but also being directly target of hate speech.
Many societies ask themselves where to draw the line which ensures freedom of speech, but also protects people against hate speech. Is there a solution in your opinion?
Several constitutions, several jurisdictions, they draw the line in different ways. For instance, the United States, basically they draw the line when you incite violence. So you can be a Ku Klux Klan group and then go on the streets and saying that you don't like Jews and all other kinds of discriminatory measures as speech. But you cannot say go there and burn them or go there and attack them. But you can say pretty much anything below that point. This is the case of the United States. The case of Europe is different because when you're using freedom of speech in order to incite discrimination and then incite racism and saying that certain group is better than other because of intrinsic characteristics such as gender, race, and LGBT and so on, sexual orientation, gender identity, and so on, you have restrictions there. And in Brazil, what we have is that the closest that we have of a legal line that we could see as a measure drawing a line between freedom of speech and hate speech was the recent case of LGBT phobia decided by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said there explicitly that the criminalization of making a discrimination against LGBT people a criminal offense does not limit the right of religious groups to deliver speech on the basis of their own religious beliefs. And then the court says explicitly that this right of freedom of speech by religious groups, the limit of this right is when they propagate hate speech. And then the Supreme Court defined hate speech as a speech, and in this decision they define hate speech as speech propagating, disseminating discrimination, hostility, or violence.
Thiago, thank you very much. This podcast was written and prepared by me, Gustavo Ribeiro. Maria Marta Bruno produced this show, and Ewan Marshall edited the final script. If you like this podcast, rate us on any platform you may be listening to Explaining Brazil. It takes only a second, but it is really important for us. And make sure to visit our website, Brazilian.report, and enjoy our free trial for 7 days. And it's really free. You don't have to submit any credit card information whatsoever. Go to Brazilian.report/subscribe. You can also support independent journalism by donating any amount to the Brazilian Report. Go to Brazilian.report/donate. If you want to follow us on Facebook and Twitter, our handle is @BrazilianReport. That's all for now. See you next week.